I have gotten a little bit of a reaction when people hear what our sermon series is for this month. You're doing what? With The Walking Dead and Frankenstein and this Sunday Dracula? What does that have to do with the faith? And those are good questions. And I know I've been known from time to time to stretch a meaning from whatever purpose, but I think it speaks directly because the Bible talks about monsters. Monsters are always something that we project our fears and our darkness on. And so we do that in a way that we can somehow cope with them, understand them, and live with them. The Bible tells us about a monster and a story about that. It's called Jonah. Jonah is given a mission by God, and Jonah, like so many of us, I'll include myself, said, "No, God, I'd rather not. I'm going to go off to a far country and escape you and your desire for me," to which he gets on a boat. There's a great storm. They determine by drawing straws that Jonah's the problem. They throw him overboard, and a big fish, big, ugly, monstrous fish swallows him up and takes him down into the deep. Now, whether you want to believe that story is literally true, or if you want to look at it figuratively, the issue is, does it relate? Have you ever been there yourself? Have you ever experienced that darkness? You see, I've tried to escape God, and I can tell you that when I have turned away from God and decided to do my own thing, I've ended up in a dark and rather smelly place. So, just as in the Bible, those images can be directives and guides for us to understand our own experience. So we today use monsters. We've talked about The Walking Dead, and we've talked about Frankenstein and what happens when we decide to go it alone. And today we're going to talk about Dracula. And I have a picture. That's the great picture of Bela Lugosi's interpretation of Dracula. It's the one I grew up with. Now they're all fancy. And they're attractive. And I imagine he was attractive at the time. I just never saw it. But he always seemed to get women, you know. And he always had that look. I love the way they interpreted that in that film. The focus was on the eyes, because the eyes were on him, and they could just draw that person to him. Nowadays, we've got young people being vampires, and there's a whole cult and literature out there that basically does the same thing. But it's an old image that goes back to about the 1700s, where people were afraid of the night and darkness and what happened to people out there, and they conjured up these stories of the living dead, these vampires who would literally suck the blood out of a person, and didn't leave them just for dead, but transitioned them into being just like them. And they would walk the night, and they would feed on other people because there was nothing inside. It's very interesting to me as I've looked at this that, as I said last week, in 1816 in Geneva, Switzerland, or near there, Mary Shelley developed her story about Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein. And she did it in the presence of Lord Byron, her husband Percy Shelley, and another person, William Polidori. I think I'm saying that right. I may not be. I apologize. He wrote out of that experience where they were talking about stories to scare each other. He wrote the story Vampire. And that was and he published it back in 1819. And then it was many years later when Bram Stoker wrote the book Dracula. And that was published in 1896. And that's a story that builds on the vampire image of someone going through the night and seeking out people, taking their life source because they have no life source within them. And so they depend for their very existence on sucking the life out of another person, turning them into a vampire, and they do the same. It's fascinating to me that in the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution was beginning and getting some real energy, that we had these stories, cautionary stories about materialism and the limits of materialism in people's lives. Way back then, 200 years ago. In the 1800s, we not only have Mary Shelley, but we also have Charles Dickens, who wrote in the mid-1800s and gave us A Christmas Carol, A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations, and other stories about the discrepancy of people who had a lot because of materialism and people who had very little, and that somehow this yearning for material things, this devouring of those things in life, was causing great violence and great harm to other people. And so at the end of that century, Bram Stoker writes his story. And it's all about bringing and presenting that somehow there is no life in yourself, that somehow you have to gain life. All of life is outside of yourself. So we are in a constant cycle of feeding, being satisfied, find ourselves wanting and empty again, which means we got to go back and we got to get fed more and more again. This, I believe, has led in the beginning of that materialism even into our day. At times it has spawned a reaction, because I think that those literary writers were not only bringing entertainment to people, stories for them to think about and talk about, but they were also social critics. They were in the prophetic tradition that this is what happens, friends, when you take things on your own, as Dr. Frankenstein, when you try to do it yourself and you leave God out, it's pretty ugly and it gets out of your control. This is what happens, friends, when you are constantly hungry, and the only way you know how to feed yourself is to suck the life out of somebody else. Do you know anybody like that? You avoid people like that, don't you? You see them coming, and you know that if you get into a conversation with them, you can just feel drained as the life goes out of you. Well, we all have that tendency, and we all have that capability of trying to find our sustenance in something that's outside of ourselves. Look at our nation. Look at our society. We are built on consuming. That somehow we've bought into, we've been given the story that we've accepted that our very identity, our esteem and our value and our worth as human beings is directly related to how much money we make, how many possessions we may have, what kind of house do we live in, what kind of car do we drive, what kind of wristwatch do we have. Does it say something about who we are? And advertising knows very well how to hook us, doesn't they? If you want to be a person of distinction, you'll drive this car. If you really want to make a statement to the world, you'll be seen at this restaurant. People with distinction. Well, the gospel comes with a whole counter narrative to us and in our world. And it's not to demean material things. It's not to place a bad comment upon the things that we can have. Because God has created all of this. And when God stepped back, God said, it is good. It is good. So the things that we have in life are meant to enhance our life and to make life better for us. But we're always called to have a perspective. We're always called to have the ability to choose how deeply we involve ourselves. One of the great things in the Christian faith right now is learning to live with simplicity. As Christians, finding our life in God and finding our sustenance in God, we are encouraged to pull back from the things that we would just accumulate. How many of us have not moved in a number of years? And when you think about moving, you know how much stuff you're going to have to go through and get rid of. That show on TV, Hoarders, it's scary to us. But a lot of us are not very far from getting there. I'm one of those people. If you ever met anybody that grew up in the 30s and lived through the Depression, they keep everything because they know someday they're going to use it. And they've got drawers full of rubber bands and old discarded buttons and hairpins and all kinds of stuff. I don't want to tell you what I got. Anyway. Those are the things that we have been given the idea that this is what it means to live. Look at the addiction in our nation. Are we really surprised that we think that somehow feeling better makes all the difference? If we can just get full of food, if we could just get full of alcohol, and it does alter our perception for a while, if we can just have a drug, then we can feel better, we can feel different. But the problem is, just like the vampire, it's temporary. And then you wake up and you're empty and you have to get your next fix. Well, Jesus comes along, and I know it's startling image and language that is used when he says, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part in me." It is through that we have eternal life. And I'm going to put up a cautionary idea for us at this point, and that is to eat Christ's flesh and to drink his blood means to feed on him, to open ourselves to him, his life and his teaching. Because the alternative and the alternate narrative is it's not about the stuff that we have that brings us life. From the very beginning, all of God's creation, human beings, their value, their worth, their identity were found in their relationship with God. It's not surprising that Adam and Eve, when they're asked to wait just a little bit, just wait for God, and the alternative comes through the serpent that says, "Hey, I got a nice shiny piece of fruit." I was going to say apple, but it doesn't really say apple. "I got a nice piece of fruit, and you know, you can feed yourself." And they saw the quick fix and they went for it. Well, goodness gracious. That's why they have fast food, isn't it? I know my car swings in there too easily. But if they would wait, and Jesus came to say, you need to wait and open yourself. Because when you wait, you will be fed with spiritual food that lasts forever. He promised the woman, the Samaritan woman at the well, here is the fountain, here is the water that will quench your thirst. He wasn't talking about her physical thirst. He was talking about her hunger and the temptation, and her thirst and the temptation to find the easy, quick fix. Just to get by until the next time you're hungry again or thirsty. We are encouraged by Christ to open ourselves to a relationship with him, which is a spiritual relationship. And that's the relationship that lasts forever, because we will someday cast aside these physical bodies, and that spirit that has lived in this world will join Christ. And we can be fed now for that life which is forever, as we take time to meditate upon his teachings and his words to us. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the peacemakers. When we read all of those things in the Beatitudes, When we read Jesus' other teachings about how the Son of Man came not to be served but to serve, and he draws disciples. And disciples are learners, students. And so we are encouraged, each one of us, to build a life and a relationship with Christ. It's a relationship that will not be a quick fix. It takes time. It's not a relationship that won't require our attention. It will take us daily opening ourselves to God's presence and being reminded. It is a relationship, though, that leads to the fullness of life, where we may have physical hungers, but our spiritual hungers will truly be fed. So our encouragement is to open ourselves, to pray, to read Scripture, to allow the very presence of God through that to nourish us each day. How many of us go through a day without eating food? How many of us go through a day without drinking water? How many of us go a day without ever exposing ourselves to God's presence or God's Word? Folks, we are hungry, spiritually hungry. There's only one way to fill that. Let us pray.